Awesome.
Nice. All right, Marie.
Woo!
Let's fucking do this.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Why do you keep asking me if I'm ready?
I don't know.
Are you ready?
I'm so ready. I'm ready.
I'm totally ready.
All right, let's do this.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Mad Scientist Podcast. I am your host, Marie Mayhew, and I am joined by Dr. Chris Cogswell. Say hello to the good people.
Hello, good people. How's it going, Marie?
It's going very well.
Yeah, you had a good week?
I had a lovely week.
Wow.
And now I am completely ready to talk about something really, really kind of skin crawling.
Just straight horrible.
Just straight up.
Straight horrible.
Straight up horrible for Surgery Part 2, the Civil War. But before we go into that, how are you doing, Chris?
Doing good. I was sick this week.
You're sick?
Well, I was sick today. I stayed home sick today.
Oh, were you, quote unquote, I'm air quoting, sick?
No, I had like a bad headache when I got up and throat thing and whatever, but
oh,
we'll see what happens tomorrow.
Oh.
I'm excited. I actually it's weird. I'm like one of those weird people that like almost, I don't enjoy being sick. I kind of enjoy being sick.
How on God's greenest earth could you enjoy being sick?
Like I don't, okay.
I have popsicles and I stay in bed and I watch SpongeBob.
I mean, yeah,
that kind of thing,
that's pretty much why I enjoy it.
Dude. Oh.
Yeah.
Man, I'm miserable when I'm sick. Like I will lay in bed like in a fetal position for 3 days and not move. And that's really what it takes for me to get better.
Damn.
For anything. Yeah, I'm worthless.
Interesting.
I'm worthless. But I don't like, it's like I'm the animal that's dying that crawls under the house. So it's away from people and it's no longer burden on others.
Paul,
that's sort of my mentality.
Leave me to die, Paul.
I'm just like, because I'm like, I don't want anybody to, have to do this or take care of me or anything. And there's always people, like maybe my significant other who's like, honey, can you pass me that Kleenex? And it requires a lot of tending, which is fine because it takes all kinds when you are sick, right?
I just like getting tended to. I think that's my problem. I like getting tended to.
Is that you? You're like, Katie, can I please have a popsicle? No, not orange. Not the orange kind. Grape.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah,
real talk. Good. Oh, who would ever pick grape? All right, we're getting into it. Let's start this episode before this turns into a whole big thing. Grape. Ridiculous. Welcome to the Mad Scientist Podcast. Today's episode, History of Surgery, Part
2. Okay, so first part of our series, we talked about sort of the origins, the worldwide origins and the cultural origins of surgery.
We sure did.
Yes.
Good synopsis.
Good synopsis. Well, I mean, and you can see like early on, there's definitely, to your point, there were the three kind of pillars that we were talking about that needed to be attended to pretty quickly, which was you had to manage pain, you had to manage disease, and man, the third one is escaping me.
You had to manage pain, disease, and bleeding.
Oh, and bleeding.
And bleeding,
yes. And to various, and up to the 1860s, the various degrees of success that was happening. And really a lot of the surgery and methods around surgery and hospitalization and sort of healthcare in some ways in general came to a weird fruition in the American Civil War. This is where you start to see, again, this sort of perfect storm that America is divided. They're gearing up for war. And when things like this happen, certain industries kick into high gear to really profit off of the market and what's happening in culture at large. And one of them being guns, ammunition, and everything behind that, sort of the weaponry behind war. And as soon as those things are implemented into, an actual battlefield, the ultimate outcome of that is like, well, how do you resolve and tend to the people that you have just injured? And so the advent of surgery and surgical methods within the time of the Civil War.
Right. But so really what I find so fascinating, so for those that haven't kind of caught on to what we're getting into here, at this point, the first episode of this series, we talked about pretty much all the way back from, the earliest recorded surgeries to basically right around the start of the 1800s. That's kind of where we are right now. And we're going to kind of gloss over some of the bigger names of the 1800s for right now to get into really what was the impetus for American surgery to get better, right? We're an American show. And so it's kind of always like our historical focus.
Yes.
But at this point, at the point of the American Civil War, for the listeners that don't know, the American Civil War started in 1861. Yes. I want to say.
Yes. And it had been, skirmishes and skirmishes. Oh my God, that's excellent. I'm squirmish talking about surgery in the Civil War. Skirmishes had been building up to that point. There had been a lot of tension and a lot of unrest in general. War actually was broke out, and the nation was divided in around it was 1861.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing with the Civil War is, for many historians, American historians are pretty much obsessed with the Civil War. Like, if there have been more books and documentaries done on the Civil War than I think probably any other war in history. It's just like, it's this, at least from American authors, it is this like constant fascination, and it's really something, it's a war that we really haven't even ultimately come to terms with, right? There are still states that fly the flag of the losing side of the Civil War. Yes. Like, it's crazy. So, but the point that I want to make, though, are twofold. First is, so at this point in time, by the 1860s, the United Kingdom was actually well on its way to solving, or, Europe, basically, that's not just the United Kingdom, but Europe, but especially focused around London and Edinburgh, were right at the point where surgery was becoming modern. And that is going on simultaneously with a bloody war in the United States, which is being dealt with barbarically in terms of the treatment of wounds and surgery. So it's very fascinating from a surgical history point of view, because it's sort of, this technology, these ideas were out there to make the outcome of the Civil War better than they were for a lot of people. Although the outcomes, actually, we're going to get into this a little bit, weren't actually all that bad for most people. The prevailing issue was still that issue of infection. But in terms of pain management and blood management, all of that was actually pretty good at that point. But it was the changes to the way that we treated or handled infection that were going on in Europe at the time that had not made their way over to the United States that really made the difference. And so for a lot of people looking at the Civil War, it's a war that was fought with modern weaponry and modern technology of death, but was utilizing basically medieval surgical and medical methods. And that is going to actually be, in my opinion, that is almost the prevailing injustice of war since the Civil War, which is that our capacity to kill each other has far outgrown and far outstripped our capacity to heal those that have been wounded by war.
Yes.
And you even see that today. All of this money is spent. I mean, we're not going to get too much into it, but we spend a huge amount of money to get bigger bombs and more guns and better tanks and armor plating and all this other junk. but we spend a negligible amount of money on treating those who come home from war and healing their wounds, both physical and psychological.
Yes.
And
or even healthcare in general.
Well, yeah.
I mean,
it's, and I think a big part of that we kind of don't want to, we don't want to think about, but it almost seems logical when you lay it out this way, is the purpose of a war isn't to heal people. The purpose of the war is to kill people.
Yes.
Right. You're hoping to enact so much carnage on the other side that, you're not caring about, you just want to kill more than the other guys did. You don't necessarily care about your people. And it's an unfortunate fact, I think. And it's one that, it's a tragedy. It's terrible.
Well, and I think, from a solely capitalist viewpoint, really there's money to be made on weaponry. Right. I mean, that's what is going to garner the most demand at that point, is what are the weapons, like to your point, like what are the most modern weapons? What are the weapons that are easy enough to get, are plentiful enough for a large amount of people, but they can also take out as many people as possible, because that, to your point, you only have so much when you start actually going into war. You're only going to have so much resources and so much ability to import or export or to get more things. So building up to it and almost stockpiling for any kind of a battle or any kind of large war is a huge money driving machine.
Sure.
Unfortunately, but it is true. And I mean, I think that was very much so the case in the Civil War in a very early stage. I mean, again, some of the weaponry that was prevalent was Colt revolvers. So again, used by both the Union and the Confederacy. Rifles, the Spencer rifle. Just looking at the Army model Colts, which are just single fire. The Henry rifle, which we actually talked about quite a bit in our Winchester Mystery House, which is again something that can only fire one round at a time, but it's still a distance weapon.
And it was able to shoot, if my memory serves correctly, it was able to shoot a number of rounds before reloading was required. So it was like you could shoot, but then you could pump and you would get another bullet in the chamber. So it was like a repeating rifle, right? But it wasn't automatic. It was not. No, I think if, again, I'm going to have to go back. I think this is almost the one before that the Henry rifle was actually an earlier version of it. Oh, that was the one. Okay, that was the one. Right. The one that won the West is the one I'm thinking. The one that won the West is the one that you actually could get five rounds into. Okay. But they did have repeating weaponry in the Civil War. They had weapons that, so, and I mean, again, like, this is all part of the gun debate that's raging in the United States right now. We have some very arbitrary rules, like, if you can shoot 7 bullets a minute, it's considered okay by law. But if it's like 8 or above, it's not okay. Like, we have some really weird arbitrary rules. And it's like, if you physically have to do something in between firing the bullet and then the next bullet, then it's considered not automatic. But if you can just shoot like a stream of bullets, it's automatic. Even if the thing you're doing can be as little as, like, whatever, just like having the gun shake against you so quickly that your finger automatically smacks into it. Like, it doesn't even have to be a like physical thing that you are doing. It's not, whatever. It doesn't matter ultimately for this discussion. But the general idea here, though, is that these guns were extremely lethal. They were accurate. They were much more lethal than the muskets that previous wars have been fought with. And you have to remember, too, this is really the first major war since the Revolutionary War the United States had been in. We had fought in other wars, but they were always like, they were kind of half-hearted, and it was small militias fighting, and it was never full-throated, like, every man in a generation is going to go fight this other team, and especially when it is your own citizenry fighting against each other.
Yes.
This war is extremely costly for the United States in terms of human lives.
And you have American settlers using weaponry against the native population, which is not considered. It should be considered war, but it's not. It's also not evenly in any circumstance evenly dispersed weapons.
No.
So Civil War is like, at this point, both sides, Confederacy and Union, have rifles, they have sidearms, they have Gatling guns, which were, again, they're almost their version of a semi-automatic repeating rifle. It was used more sparingly because ammunition and the waste of ammunition and getting ammunition for the troops was considered a major concern. So, but they had a huge amount of weaponry. Also, one of the biggest changes that really affected the wounds and the damage that these weapons could do was the advent of the Menet ammunition. So before this, ammunition itself was mostly round. So it was like a musket ball.
Okay.
And it had only a certain amount of, we can get all sciencey up in this, it had only a certain amount of propulsion coming out of the weapon, right?
Sure.
Because it was round and it was not aerodynamic. It was just fired.
Yeah.
The Menet was actually the first pointed or conical shaped. So when it hit on impact, it drove into a body much further and did much more damage than a round musket type artillery.
Right. So to kind of get into that science a little bit, so aerodynamics, it sounds really complicated, but it's actually relatively simple. And it's one of the few physics things that there is like a pretty well-known worldwide thing we can all agree on with this or think about. So imagine you're at home right now and you're waving your hand in the air.
Which I'm doing.
Okay, me too. It's great. Been doing it the whole time, Marie. If
it
your
makes
hand,
such good podcasting too.
It really does. If you're that whooshing sound and that like out of breath thing you get after 3 hours of doing it. Okay, if your hand is like flat, like you're waving hello to someone, and you move it up and down in the air, like forward and back, so that your hand is pointing, like the palm of your hand is pointing in the direction that you're waving, you feel force, or you feel air. You feel some of that air on your hand, right?
Yes.
So as you move your hand, your arm, your hand itself is actually pushing some of that air out of the way, and the air is in turn providing some resistance to your hand. And so that the amount of force that is going to be applied to your hand, the resistance, is proportional to the amount of surface area that is available for air to touch, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're moving your hand flat like that, where the palm is facing the direction that you're moving it towards, you're actually providing a lot of surface, and so there's going to be more resistance on your hand from the air. Now, if you move your hand so that it's like a chopping motion, right? And so the side of your hand is actually pointing towards the direction that you're moving, you mm-hmm. feel much less resistance. You hardly feel any air at all, mm-hmm. right? And that is because the amount of surface area that you're pushing against the air with is much smaller. So the air provides less resistance or drag to your hand. And I mean, for a better example of that, you can think about like in a pool. If you had your hand out and you pushed it along the water, your hand would actually cause a wave to form, right? Mm-hmm. Because it has a lot of surface to create force with. But if your hand was in that chopping motion and you slid it through the water, it would be able to float through the water, move through the water much more easily, because again, there's less surface area there. And so a rounded bullet, if you just think about like the face of the rounded bullet as it moves through the air, there's that big circular face available for air to hit off of, right?
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine when it impacts, it's almost buffered because it's already had much more
Well, it's moving a lot slower. And then also because when it hits the body, then like it's going to have a much harder time moving through the body as well, because it's like a blunt force instrument. It's not cutting, it's not piercing, right?
Yes.
Whereas that edged bullet, that conical shaped bullet, the one that we all think of when we think of a bullet, that tip there, that area that's really small, that means that all of the force of the bullet is touching your body at that very small area, that small point.
Ugh.
And so there's just a lot more force in one area to allow for a lot more damage and a lot more motion through the body. Right. And then, of course, like for aerodynamics and all that stuff, the shape of the object also matters. Like in terms of the bullet, if it's conical shaped with that pointed edge basically provides an area for the air to like, it'll basically create a film off the top of the edge.
Uh-huh.
And so there's going to be like a zone, like basically like an umbrella almost.
Yeah.
The area below that edge is not going to feel any resistance. So it can float, like there's just a lot less area again. Whereas on a circular object, it'll come up, but then it'll actually come back around the bottom again. So it like all of it feels resistance. So
and that is, sorry, go ahead, finish.
No. So yeah, so that's basically like the quick and dirty aerodynamic lesson for today, listeners. So good job getting through it.
But I would say too, like that had a huge impact. So the Manet ball, as it's called, when it hit a body, it did so much more damage than a normal round. Like I'm looking online, and it's in basically extensive damage as it changed shape on impact, shattering 2 to 3 inches of bone and dragging skin and clothes into the wound. So, like you were saying, with sort of the resistance and this umbrella effect coming over it has such an impact going in that it takes whatever it's hitting and pretty much almost drags it into the wound with it, shattering through bone.
Yeah, it has enough force to actually hit, like it has enough force that it won't go through bone. It will go through bone all of a sudden. And so this is like a huge, like, I think I read a statistic. I can't remember the exact statistics. So I don't, whatever, but it's
still gross.
It was big. Yeah, still gross. But basically
it's really gross.
during the Revolutionary War, the vast majority of soldiers who went out came home because they didn't die from their wounds, because it was like, again, it was a bullet, like a circular musket bullet hitting your body at a much lower speed, right?
Yeah, impact.
And potentially not even breaking skin sometimes. I mean, most of the times it did, right? But like the ability to actually aim and shoot was much less. Your lethality from far away was greatly reduced at a much higher rate than it would be for this new type of bullet. And also, too, the fact that when the bullet the fact that the bullet can get deeper into the body means that to remove it, we have to cut into the body to get it.
Yes. And it's dragging in all the dirt and anything that's on the surface of the clothes or the uniform that the soldier is wearing. So any kind of muck, any kind of anything that they've already been dragged through is now inside of their body.
Yeah,
however long.
It's pretty much creating like the perfect storm of infection, right?
Yeah.
And what's actually really interesting is, so let's set the stage quickly for where. So we've talked about the lethality of the Civil War a bit, right? About kind of what's the word? Kind of the numbers that we're talking about here with people in terms of it. The Union Army started out with 2.2 million soldiers. 110,000 of those were killed in action or died of their wounds.
Man, yes. The statistic I had is there was about 60,000 quote unquote surgeries performed.
Yeah.
So, and again, air quoting surgery, because surgery really 2/3, not even 3/4 of those were straight out amputation.
Yeah.
So that is the most prevalent surgery that is going to occur within the Civil War.
Well, so the other thing too is, so that's just the Union side, right? So 110,000 were killed in action or died of their wounds. 365,000 were the total dead.
Mm-hmm.
So if only 110,000 of those died from wounds or died in action, then that other 230,000 were considered accidental or disease-related deaths. On the Confederate side, it was 94,000 killed in action, and then 290 or 137,000 wounded, 290,000 total dead. So the total casualties on both sides, the total deaths on both sides were close to 1 million dead.
Oh.
And it was a
so
million.
So much of it was
like a million. I mean, and the thing is, the scale of the people, like the scale of that, if we think about like the scale of that even today, right? The U.S. population is, 330 million people, right? So 1 million people died during the Civil War. That's a huge amount still, right? Yes. And if we go back more, I think the oldest census records that are available is from like maybe the 1890s, maybe, right? Like the 1900s probably is the latest we can get. The 1900s, there were 76 million people in the United States. And 1 million people died during the Civil War. So, you could imagine like the scale of that is tremendous.
Yeah, and that at least the majority of them died from infection, right?
Yeah.
That was which is an incredibly gruesome, painful way of dying. It's not like, you were killed instantly on the battlefield. It's that you had this prolonged agony of something being amputated and then infection taking hold, which we're going to talk more about because it's so pretty to talk about. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, so you have this huge influx of weapons. You have this huge call to arms, to your point, like all these people, all these young men around 18 years of age coming into battle and going into the army. Guess how many actual surgeons there were that they brought on, and they said, you are recognized, you are trained surgeons.
I want to say it was like 1% of the total soldier population.
114.
What?
Were in the U.S. Army. 114. 24 of them resigned to join the Confederacy and establish the Confederate Medical Services.
Wait, is this before? Right? This is when the war.
1861.
Okay, so this is when the war kicks off.
The war kicks off. So again, you have been gearing up on weapons. You have, since around, I want to say 1840, you had the Minet bullet, which is, and which is going to cause more damage, which is known to cause more damage. It is now sort of the gold standard for ammunition. You have under 200 surgeons. That have any sort of training, on any of this.
That's insane.
It is insane. And it also speaks to sort of, again, where the American Civil War mindset is that you are so focused on what it's going to take to extinguish what you have to extinguish, the fire in front of you, which is the Confederacy or the Union, depending on what side you're on, that you haven't really reconciled until you are actually in battle what you're going to need to do to keep people whole.
So, oh my God, that's crazy.
Oh, I know. I was a little surprised by that as well.
That's amazing. 114.
114.
Goodness.
And so, as you can imagine, there was a lot of consternation about, especially after the First major battles, that the people that were performing, these surgeons, were butchers, that they were basically underqualified, they were amateurs, they had no training, and they were called butchers.
Sure.
But if you think about it, if you step back and you look at it in a much larger context, which is they're completely overwhelmed, they have absolutely no, if few, resources to call upon, and everyone is getting shot, then you're constantly in siege mentality. So this is what you are going to have to react to. And it basically, what I was reading is an amputation itself, they got down to under 10 minutes.
Sure.
So from beginning to end, under 10 minutes. Yeah. And they had to do that just to be proficient, just to keep moving.
Just to keep people wounded going through the door.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. So I actually had a quote here that I liked from Dr. John Letterman.
Yes.
Who is the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. He says, or Potomac, and this is in his report after the Battle of Antietam, he says, quote, "The surgery of these battlefields has been pronounced butchery. Gross misrepresentation." Let me try that one again, Marie. Quote, "The surgery of these battlefields has been pronounced butchery. Gross misrepresentations of the conduct of medical officers have been made and scattered broadcast over the country, causing deep and heart-rending anxiety to those who had friends or relatives in the Army who might at any moment require the services of a surgeon. It is not to be supposed that there were no incompetent surgeons in the Army. It is certainly true that there were. But these sweeping denunciations against a class of men who will favorably compare with the military surgeons of any country, because of the incompetency and shortcomings of a few, are wrong, and do injustice to a body of men who have labored faithfully and well. It is easy to magnify an existing evil until it is beyond the bounds of truth. It is equally easy to pass by the good that has been done on the other side. Some medical officers lost their lives in their devotion to duty in the Battle of Antietam, and others sickened from excessive labor which they conscientiously and skillfully performed. If any objection could be urged against the surgery of those fields, it would be the effort on the part of surgeons to practice conservative surgery to too great an extent."
Yeah.
It's pretty fascinating that it's fascinating to think about these poor people who were kind of thrown into this. And, I think the role of the Army medical personnel is always romanticized in some ways because, and I think to a large extent, it's because of the heroism and the just the terrible position that they're put into, right? I mean, Can you imagine? I mean, surgery at that point in time, so let's just set the stage quickly. At this point in time, we knew how to control blood flow to some extent and stop blood from kind of completely. We knew enough to know that blood loss could kill you. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
And so we knew that we had to limit blood loss, and we had to tie up veins and arteries and stuff if we amputated. We also knew enough to utilize some relatively new versions of anesthetics, right?
Yeah, so we're beginning to, within the later years of the war, we're beginning to become more prevalent.
Yeah, so in 1840, I'm trying to get the exact year here in my notes, 1847 was the first time that ether, or chloroform rather, was utilized on humans to be used basically as a method of, anesthesia, right? That was really the first time that it was used for this purpose. And so, and what they found was that it could be used to perform surgery without any kind of pain. The person that took in the chloroform would not feel pain. Now, obviously, if any of you watch true crime shows or anything, you know that chloroform is kind of a bad one to use because it can it can kill you. And it can also, it knocks you out, but it can kill you if you've taken too much chloroform.
Yes, which, again, just another fun side effect, right?
Yeah. So the other one that was used were ethers, right? And so again, though, these were methods of basically knocking someone out so that surgery could be performed on them.
Right. But for the Civil War, if you did not have chloroform, or if it was before that, or any kind of ether, basically, the primary amputation happened like 1 to 2 days after the injury sometimes, right? So at that point, sure, you are delusional. You're going in and out of consciousness. Infection may have already started to occur, and you're in shock. So they're going to amputate, and the surgeon, his form of anesthesia is to have people hold you down. So to have upwards of maybe 3 to 4 men literally physically restrain you while he takes off whatever limb it is that has been injured.
Sure.
Which is like, again, that is, to me, it's like, oh my, so you're in all of this pain. And there is no recourse from it. And I think it's especially like that quote from Letterman is especially like at the end when it's like, doctors who gave their life in battle, and then some of them just dropped dead from exhaustion.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine your entire day is you are sawing limbs off of someone and triaging someone, right, and having people, hold them down. And then even at that point, so even if that was successful, quote unquote, there was a chance for a secondary amputation, which was maybe after 3 days, if there was any sort of infection that was starting to come up.
Well, here's the thing, right? So okay, at this point we knew after so the first use of diethyl ether in the United States, and actually the first use of it in the world, was in Boston on 16th of October 1846. There's actually still a really cool plaque about where this occurred at Massachusetts General Hospital. And it was in 1846 that dentist William Thomas Green Morton used diethyl ether to basically he induced ether on someone, and then a surgeon, John Collins Warren, removed a tumor from the neck of a patient. And that occurred in a surgical amphitheater that is now known as the Ether Dome, because it's where ether was first utilized for this purpose.
The Ether Dome!
Yeah, which is really cool. And so,
Sorry.
No, it's okay. And so, yeah, this basically, so this is 1846 that this was first used. It became really widely available, really like, I want to say widely available around, maybe around like the 1850s. Right. But really, it was not taught, or it was not a standard method that was really used until the first textbook on it came out, which was in 1900s, 1914, which was kind of really the standard reference called Anesthesia, that was by Dr. James Taylor Gwathmey and the chemist Dr. Charles Baskerville. And so that was really the first, the first use of ether outside of, say, the first production, the first use of it really widespread across the world, all that kind of stuff that we come to think of as modern surgery.
Yeah.
So ether, chloroform, these compounds were not, while they were used during the Civil War, they were not necessarily commonplace.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like Marie said, the most common form of performing these surgeries was, here's some whiskey, we're going to hold you down, bite on this leather strap, and get ready for the pain.
And the pain, so the other thing too that is amazing to me, speaking of pain, is really the very few instruments a surgeon had to perform any of
absolutely.
this. Right?
Yeah.
So there was a sort of almost like a standard issue Civil War medic kit for amputation for surgeons. And we can put it up, we can put it in the show notes or up on the web. We have pictures of them. And I'll read through them and I will describe them really quick. So there is a surgical scalpel, which looks all the world like a steak knife. Like when you think of a scalpel, you almost think of an X-Acto looking thing that is, gleaming steel, stainless steel. And
they're
sharp.
Clean. They're clean.
They're clean. And if they're not, they look clean. This looks like a steak knife, a dull steak knife.
And just to put it out there for people too, in reading the accounts of surgeons, in between surgeries, they were not cleaning off their knives.
No.
They were not cleaning these tools. So you can imagine.
They weren't cleaning anything.
They were not, the idea of infection as even a potential, like they knew enough to say that having people in a hospital was probably a bad idea because they seemed to get sick. But the cause of that sickness was thought to be miasma. And so miasma, for those that don't know what that term means, it's used to great effect in Dark Souls, which is the best video game of all time.
Oh my God.
So miasma,
shout out Game Reference.
Miasma is basically like, it means noxious odor, like an unpleasant gas cloud that brings disease with it, basically. And so it was thought that hospital wards had these miasmas seeping from the wounds of sick patients. And so that's why people outside in the country who were getting better more readily than people who had surgeries in hospitals, it was because
fresh air.
Right. It was the clean, fresh air. It was the access to clean air and water. It was not the fact that the surgeon had it probably at least washed his knife from the day before when he was amputating legs down the road. Yeah. So this knife that they were using, like there's these really interesting descriptions of surgeons who had like their favorite knives, right? And like, they had knives that they I haven't cleaned this knife since I started, and they'd all, oh, you superstitious fellow. And little do they know, he's like, the vector for, like
patient zero.
He's personally spread herpes to more humans than any other, you know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculous. So anyways, okay. So
even if they wanted to clean them, I think the sheer volume of how they had to perform, they didn't have a lot of chance to. So then we have the straight forceps, which are bullet extractors for removing the lead projectiles or whatever is left of them, which again almost looks like getting more modern. It's almost very fine pliers. My personal favorite, the large amputation saw, which is a saw. Like if you saw this, you're like, oh yeah, you would saw logs with that. No, that there's a surgical instrument. It went into a case. Scissors curved for cutting tissue and bandages. So again, like they were using the same things on human flesh and skin and tissue, but they were using to cut bandages, to cut off any kind of diseased or any kind of anything that was still on the uniform that was still on the soldier. So very low sanitation there. A probe to locate foreign objects in the wound, metal or bone, which looks like a very long, almost like a stir for drinks.
I was gonna say the probe is pretty much the probe is pretty much just like it's just a
drink
stick.
Stir. It's just a stick.
They could have called it a poker. It's just a stick, a poking rod.
It's a long stick, and then also the teneculum, used for seizing and holding body parts during surgery, such as arteries, etc. So these look like something out of Hellraiser. Really? I mean, come on, man. This is total Clive Barker territory. They're curved hooks on wooden just like wooden holders. And they are basically, again, just something that would seize into the skin to hold it in place, or that would stop bleeding. That could hold something like an artery together, so you would minimize your bleeding.
Yeah. So we actually still I don't do this kind of crap.
I hope not.
We as the general, like the world, we does still actually use this tool. And it's actually it's interesting. Because Katie's got all these tools for vet school, right? It's these studies have like expanded it out now to other things. And so it's this basically today they look like scissors, but they have in particular they have these like they have there's a closing mechanism on them where you can basically close them and then they stay closed and they stay clamped really tightly so that you can pinch this, whatever it is, the artery, the whatever you need to pinch to stop blood flow. So then you can sew it closed.
They do not look like Hellraiser torture hooks.
No, they look relatively, they just look like crappy scissors.
Right.
But, you know,
oh God.
Little do you know.
Yeah. So I'm in a tourniquet, which is again just a length of gauze or a length of rope,
length
almost.
Of cloth. Yeah.
A bone brush used to remove bone saw dust from the cutting site. So if you have time to tidy up afterwards, right? You got this little brush for it. Which is just.
You know what's really actually kind of really scary to me, or this is going to be gross. This is going to sound super gross.
Oh, do you? No worries. Yeah.
Okay. Are you ever
I'm just
awake?
having some wine. Hold on. Okay. Go ahead.
Just finish your glass. Are you ever awake? Are you ever awake at the dentist for when they do stuff to your teeth?
Yeah. Do I have?
Okay.
Wait, is there an option not to be?
No. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, like.
Wait, is there?
So no. There usually isn't. But like every time that I have had any kind of dental surgery, it's always been under general anesthesia. So I've never gotten like laughing gas or anything like that, which, by the way, laughing gas was discovered about 5 years before diethyl ether and would have made that guy also super famous. But when he administered it wrong, and so when he did the surgery, the patient was like, ow. So he got screwed. But anyways, so like the smell of like the dentist drilling into your teeth. Oh my God, that smell is so.
And the sound.
Oh my God, that's like I can just imagine. Yep. I don't even know if because like I mean I'm sure and
that's with a high frequency drill.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the smell of a surgery room.
Oh yeah, well, we're going to get to that. Camp. We'll talk about the smells coming up next because that's just lovely. An amputation knife, which again is a longer bladed knife, not serrated. It looks all the world like a knife that you would use to carve a turkey. Caitlin, which is a small double-edged knife. So it is a smaller, almost like a shiv, really, which is double-edged. So you could cut from either side. And it's a much smaller blade. It looks like only about 4 or 5 inches long. So that, in general, was the majority of the instruments that would be found in a surgeon's kit.
Sure.
Performing these things.
And really though, just to put it in perspective, that's like pretty close to what we have today still. We don't have a saw necessarily. I mean, sometimes you do. Sometimes you do use a saw.
We have more like power tools. So if you're an orthopedist,
right,
an orthopedic surgeon or a spine surgeon, you have things that are mechanical. Drills or almost robotic at this point.
So actually that's a point that they mention in a lot of these books on surgery is that these surgeons at the time had to be like ungodly strong. Yeah. Right? These were extremely strong people because they were basically well, besides that, they were holding down people in their throes of pain and were, I mean, just imagine cutting through, I mean, a hip in 10 minutes or less, right? So not even 10 minutes just to get the cut. Being able to cut it, sew it up, clean it up, get it ready for them to go out to another place. That all of that in 10 minutes, that requires extreme strength, extreme like sureness or fortitude. You know what I mean? Like it's the abilities of these surgeons, I think I mean, I agree that it's terrible that they've been, I mean, they were limited by their knowledge. They were not limited by it wasn't like they wanted to do it this way.
No,
You know
I
what I
think
mean?
that this was all bore out of necessity, right?
Right.
And they've been maligned for having to act in a certain way just to preserve whatever life they possibly could.
Right.
And I think that's, I mean, just thinking about it kind of makes me like, oh. But what is the good part too? What's extra special about all of this is, so you've gotten through a whole couple of days worth of surgeries, right? And the battle is pretty much winding down for the day, if it ever does. And you have just all of these body parts that have been removed or that are damaged or that have been, wounded or are starting to putrefy. One of the articles I found in the Smithsonian Magazine, which again is where I go to when I want to find something extra special, very, very relevant, very well detailed and documented, and also really disgusting. A nurse describes the smell of the Civil War. And this woman that they documented talking to, Carolyn Hancock, was 23 when she served as a nurse after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. She found the smell of decaying bodies so strong that she viewed it as an oppressive, malignant force capable of killing wounded men who were forced to lie amongst the corpses until the medical corps could reach them. So it was the smell was so oppressive and so terrible that it had the ability to kill. So almost like the miasma.
Miasma. That is the miasma idea.
That is the miasma. But it's a real thing. A sickening, overpowering, awful stench announced the presence of the unburied dead, which in the July sun the dead upon which the July sun was mercilessly shining. And at every step, the air grew heavier and fouler until it seemed to possess a palatable, horrible density that could be seen and felt with the cut of a knife.
Jesus.
I know.
So,
right? So what do you like? I mean, it's like,
So one other thing that really made the Civil War such, I mean, like we keep alluding to, obviously this was butchery, right? This was people being mowed down by their fellow countrymen, and then these poor people go to another person, a surgeon who is one of 114 potentially, right? I'm sure along the way they must have trained people on the job, but still,
you'd have
someone without significant training who is, forced to do this terrible work day in and day out. It's pretty horrendous. But really so they've actually done some studies to see, as far as they can tell, at least, did surgery during the Civil War actually, was it beneficial to the soldiers? And they've actually found in some cases, like amputations, in general, amputation doubled the survival rate.
Yes.
Of a soldier. So it actually was beneficial for amputation to occur. But the thing that really was the most deadly was infection. And one of the reasons that infection was such a big deal, besides the lack of cleanliness and all of that other stuff, was that during the Civil War, at the time, the ideas of Hippocrates and Galen of the humors were still prevalent in the surgical, in the mind of basically all, knowledgeable people, right? And so when a wound started to show pus, it was thought that it was healing correctly as opposed to getting infected.
Yes.
Because the pus was viewed as evidence that the body was kind of reinstating some level of balance for itself, right?
If it was white, right?
Right. If it was white in particular, white and thick pus was considered to be a really great sign of healing, when in fact it meant your body is trying to kill itself, right? Your body is trying to clear out this infection as best it can. And so those cases where people were really the ones that should have been getting either secondary amputations or further wound cleaning of some sort. They didn't even know at the time to clean the wounds, right? They didn't even know to clean the wounds. They thought they had no notion that was a thing that should be done, even. So it's quite. I mean, it's fascinating to think that the character who is going to be really the focus of our next episode, Lister, who is really the father of cleanliness in hospitals and in surgeries, and really brought about the revolution in infection control. He was a student at the time of the Civil War in the United Kingdom, and to think that had he had his ideas, or had he been born a few years earlier, a lot of the deaths of the Civil War might have been avoided. It's really fascinating to me.
But I mean, even besides the surgery, I mean, if you look at sort of the general conditions of the Civil War and what was going on, that there's poor or no hygiene. There was no sanitary disposal of garbage or human waste. The diets and the food that people were eating were no fresh fruits, no fresh vegetables.
Well, did you ever see there was a documentary on Netflix called Filthy Cities? It wasn't like it was like a series of documentaries. It was more like a TV show, I guess. But it was
not.
Okay.
You know why? Because I'm probably going to watch Arrested Development or It's Always Sunny when I go to Netflix. You're like, ooh, Filthy Cities.
No, It's Always Sunny's off Netflix now, Marie.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah.
What is going on with Netflix?
I don't know what they're doing.
I couldn't find it.
It's ridiculous.
That's it. We're not taking them on as a sponsor, man. I don't care how often they ask us.
No,
I'm joking.
We would. Netflix, please give us money.
Yeah.
I've got a great write-up about a boy and his cats. It's really heartwarming stuff. So the really big thing that was from this documentary was talking about the way that sanitation was revolutionized in the modern city. And so it looked at New York City, it looked at Paris, and it looked at London. Like the conditions of a civil, like those conditions were not much different. I mean, obviously there was a lot more blood and death ever present, but in terms of the sanitation, like sanitation was pretty terrible everywhere, right?
Yes.
Again, we at this point in time, there is absolutely the prevailing notion of why people get sick is that a bad smell comes into their homes and it infects them with disease, which like is kind of funnily not that far off in some cases, like with a cold, right? A sneeze travels through the air and can then make you sick.
Well, yeah.
But that's the prevailing notion of how disease is transmitted. And there is no notion of public cleanliness or the need for sanitation in large bodies of people, even in polite society, let's say at this point, right? So the fact that, like it's all of these things come together. Again, our ability to kill each other had far outstripped our ability to take care of ourselves,
to sustain life. Yeah.
Right. And so it is fascinating. Yeah. But so we've talked about all the terrible things about the Civil War, but some good advances for medicine, for surgery, and in particular for emergency management came out of the Civil War.
Yes.
So we're looking at things like ambulances.
Yes.
The notion of a triage center, of how to actually rank cases, and then also the American Red Cross. The idea of a need for specific and trained doctors to go out to places that don't have them, right? So first off, the idea of triage is fascinating because it's one of those things where we don't think of it as even being an idea. Right. Like we don't even think about it being like, we're like, yeah, of course it is. Like, of course that's a thing that has to happen. Right.
We have the luxury of perspective too. Like,
right.
If you're in a burning building and everything's on fire, which is what I would equate like the Civil War to. It's like trying to figure out, how do I prioritize? Must have been like, there's no fucking priority. You're just going to have to throw water as much fire as you possibly can. And
right, of course.
Actually being able to triage and be like, hey, no, we have to step back and look at this in this way is, to me, like that's mind boggling.
Yeah, it's one of those areas though where I think a lot of like so first off, for those that don't know what triage even means, which was definitely me before this episode. I had some idea, like I'd been to a triage center, and like I knew I knew that after an earthquake, if you were a doctor going to a hospital, you had to yell, "Someone get me to triage." Or like, it's crazy in triage. Take him to triage. Like, I knew that was a thing you yelled, but I didn't know why. Oh. So triage this is a definition of triage. It is the assignment of degrees of urgency to wounds or illnesses to decide the order of treatment of a large number of patients or casualties. Now, the reason that this is so fascinating, and actually this is part of a larger question, it was one of the most fascinating parts of probably one of the most fascinating college courses I ever took, which is the idea of ranking body parts, ranking diseases, putting value on like that sort of arithmetic around human lives is such a foreign. It is such an obvious concept to us today, where we think of like supermodels putting out insurance claims on their legs, right? Or
that was a left turn. No, I'm still with you.
Well, no, seriously, that is serious though. I mean, I think Heidi Klum's legs are insured for like $1 million each or something. It's crazy.
They've depreciated.
Let's not go there, Marie.
Come on, depreciation jokes are funny.
So but Heidi, we can't besmirch Heidi Klum on the show, Marie.
No, and I'm not besmirching
the idea though that you could like this let's put it this way. If you are in that situation where you have 5 patients and they all are hurt and you're like, well, which one do I pick to do? If I pick this guy first, this guy's going to die. If I do him first, then he might not die. But this other guy who is in better shape might die in the time that it takes me to get to him. Who do you pick?
Right.
That is an impossible moral question for a person to make, especially one under the distress of having 5 injured people in their room. So the idea of triaging, where you almost dehumanize the situation you take it out of the surgeon's hands. It's not my decision to treat Billy versus Bob. It's up to the hospital. It's up to medical good rules. It's up to the triage guidelines.
A standard, sort of, I don't want to say universal, but a known standard that if you go to this hospital, it will be the same as the other hospital.
Absolutely.
Eventually. Maybe not in the 1800s, but definitely to that point.
Right. And so
this is the known equations.
Right. And so it gets rid of that sense of sort of personal responsibility of, well, you know what? I tried to deal with these guys and I couldn't. But this is how we had to do it.
Yes.
Right.
And if you can imagine what would be early triage in Civil War, first of all, the smell, as we're hearing, is disgusting and is almost overwhelming. People are probably screaming and delusional. So, I mean, being able to prioritize or think about this person is in more pain than this person, or this person needs medical help more than or before anyone else. To me, it's that. Yeah, as you speak to it, it's the moral implications of having to take that on. There's no way you're going to make a clear or rational decision because it is so overwhelming.
Yeah. So it actually two of these. So this idea of triage and even the idea of ambulances came from one person, Jonathan Letterman, who was a major in the Union Army, and
who was your quote earlier?
Yeah,
they're not butchers. Yes.
Yeah, was the quote earlier. He really had a huge effect on not only Civil War outcomes for patients, but I mean patients throughout history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really, he's kind of he would be kind of if we're talking about who are the fathers of surgery, Letterman would kind of be the father of emergency care.
Yes.
Right. So what he did was after the Second Manassas battle. So actually, for those that don't know much about the Civil War, I suggest Shelby Foote's Civil War is a really good book on it. Although there's 3 of them and they are extremely long. I only read the first 2, and then the third one I had to get on Audible because I was like, not again, Shelby. But
not again, man.
I was like, I gotta finish. I know how it ends, but I gotta finish.
I'm going home and getting in a fetal position and weeping for humanity.
So what happened was after the Battle of Second Manassas, what occurred was basically it took an extremely long time to remove all of the wounded and dead from the battlefield. So people, like men, were on the battlefield begging for water or treatment or help for a week in some cases. A week or more, right?
Dear God. Yeah.
And so what happened was the general at the time, George McClellan, said, okay, well, listen, and again, the Civil War, the Union ran through generals like, we just had a whole bunch. But George McClellan gave him basically the okay to just do what you got to do to make this better, right? To make this medical thing work a little bit better for us. And so what he instituted were 3 major ideas. The first one is the idea of triage. And so basically what that would look like for a patient was, if you are in imminent danger of death, you get treated first. If you are likely to survive, you'll get treated, but still like deathly wounded or really wounded, you get treated second. And then those that are there, the guy who didn't make it to the battle because he had bone spurs, he gets treated last.
Yeah.
So zing, by the way. But so okay, but then Letterman. All right, so Letterman really is the father of modern emergency medicine, and he created a couple of important things. First is triage, and triage again is this idea that if you are about to die, you will get treated first over someone who just has a flesh wound, or someone who sprained an ankle or something on the battlefield. Like someone who is really, really in deathly danger will get treated first. And so he created a method for dealing with that. The second one was an ambulance corps. So creating a team of men who would go out with stretchers and wagons and things and pick up wounded soldiers and bring them back.
Which is amazing. Which
is a great idea, right?
Which seems like a relatively simple idea, except they're doing it on a battlefield.
Right. And then, he came up with, the thing is that during the Civil War, battles happened during the day.
Mm-hmm.
Right? At nighttime, you couldn't see, you couldn't fight at night. And so at nighttime, when the battles ended, this is when the ambulance corps would go out and get these people.
Still, dear God.
Still terrifying, but
in the dark with a stretcher.
But a very war still was relatively gentlemanly at that time. And the next one was actually the creation of what was termed the evacuation system. And this was basically 3 different types of medical places for wounded soldiers. The first being a field dressing station, which was near the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And this would be, you bring these people off the battlefield, you apply tourniquets, you do whatever you got to do to get them survivable, and then you move them. And then you move them to a field hospital, which is near the battlefield. And these field hospitals are usually the most haunted of the Civil War areas. And so those are usually like someone's home or a barn or something. Yes. And so this was where
tent hospitals where you would get sort of patched together.
So the field dressing station is the tent hospital. The field hospital is like where the surgeries were happening. Right? And then after the surgery occurred, they would also then have bigger hospitals in like centralized locations where people could then recuperate. Right?
Yes. which are definitely fucking haunted.
And then on top of that too, Letterman really created a system where, like, a big part of the Civil War was actually stopping supplies from getting to place. Mm-hmm. And the North had a huge advantage because the North had rail. We had a railroad system.
Yeah.
But like that was a big part of the Civil War was skirmishes and battles, or like espionage almost, where one side would go and destroy the rail lines of another side to try to kind of pinch them in, where, okay, well, you can't get supplies anymore. Now we'll keep them here until they basically can't fight any longer. So Letterman came up with basically distribution systems for medical supplies, whereas before it had been not for medical supplies, it had been for weapons and bullets and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So the ambulance corps really was tested the first time at the Battle of Antietam, not tested per se, but really proven to be useful. There were 23,000 casualties, and they were removed from the battlefield in less than 24 hours. So an amazing feat.
Which is amazing, yes.
An amazing feat of human engineering. So Letterman really did an amazing job, really. And really, his contributions to medicine can't be overstated. You know what I mean? Like, he was extremely, extremely important to this. The other really good thing that came out of the Civil War was the American Red Cross.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where this was created by Clara Barton, who was a nurse in the American Civil War. And she was born in Massachusetts, which is really cool. And you can actually shout out Massachusetts, very awesome. And so she basically created this what's the word? She basically created a method of moving about teams of women, mm-hmm. specifically to bring supplies and food and stuff to wounded soldiers.
Yes.
Right. And so she created a method basically a system for moving about medical supplies and moving about these things that people needed while they were getting better at these hospitals. Right.
Yeah. To get supplies in and to help relieve where necessary. Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so basically she created she really did create the first charitable organization for the treatment of soldiers.
Yes.
Right. And really became known as the Angel of the Battlefield, was a title for her, or the American Nightingale, mm-hmm. after Florence Nightingale.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. And so she basically became a source of comfort. Her and her teams became a source of comfort to soldiers as they got better. And really, I mean, without the American Red Cross, without Clara Barton, the idea of, I guess, a nurse as someone to treat, someone who's not necessarily doing medical treatment in terms of surgeries or whatever, but applying the treatments, giving medicines, being
stabilize morale, like
absolutely
have someone to talk to actually, have someone that cares about your condition at that time was probably huge.
Yeah. So it became extremely important. And so she basically became after the war a person who fought for the rights of soldiers and veterans, right? To talk about missing men from the war in particular, mm-hmm. right? So she ran an office that was the Office of Missing Soldiers, which basically was to find or identify soldiers killed or missing in action. And they were able to find more than 22,000 missing men.
Wow.
Which is amazing.
That is amazing.
And so they were able to find and then bury these men, and again, really doing a tremendous service again to veterans, and really started the idea of thanking veterans for, maybe not thanking veterans for their service. The idea of
acknowledging the loss, right?
Right.
And keeping total of what the war cost in actual human life, and that's
right.
Someone's brother, husband, son. That's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so she really then became basically something of a consultant to different places during their own wars, right? So she in particular was part of the Franco-Prussian War. Where she helped to create military hospitals, and then basically created all these different things that were helpful to the movement of these items, medicines, bandages, clothing, food, water, all these things, right? Yeah. And so she actually ended up receiving, for her time in the Franco-Prussian War and helping to do these things, she ended up receiving a Prussian Iron Cross, which is super amazing.
That is amazing.
And then that work there where so basically this was part of the Red Cross already existed in some ways in Switzerland. And it was after her time in the Franco-Prussian War that the idea of the American Red Cross started. And so she began, basically fighting for this, fighting for this group to exist.
That's amazing. The one thing, though, that I didn't hear you mention in everything that she gave that actually kind of just came into my head when we were talking about this is so after the war, everyone always, a huge amount of soldiers have amputations. So the need for artificial limbs.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes, totally.
Right? Which is a huge, again, something that has come so far, again, with 3D printing, and we can talk more about that, but that now there is this market and this industry for the artificial limbs. And something that happened that I think is also interesting, that a large group of veterans, both in the North and the South, did not want to wear the artificial limb. And even they did get money back, or they were eligible to collect, to actually put towards one, but they didn't want it because they didn't want the idea of charity. But then also the importance of pinning up an empty sleeve or trouser leg instead of hiding the injury was called the honorable scar. Huh. So it was a way of making their sacrifice very visual and showing that they gave this for their country, especially immediately after the war. So people, again, general civilians after the war had a very visual reminder of what
that this person did. Yeah, right.
That this is what the cost, right? That this is the cost of it. Instead of trying to mask it or to, which again, in my opinion, the idea of the advent of artificial limbs and being able to augment the human body is a huge advent and is fascinating in itself. But the idea of sort of negating that and saying, no, this is the physical toll on humanity.
Sure.
Writ small on the individuals who fought it is a pretty moving and pretty, emotional reminder.
Absolutely.
From both sides of the war at that point.
No, totally. So after she returned from the Franco-Prussian War, she came back to the United States, founded the American branch of the Red Cross, and then basically fought with the government for official recognition and funding, and specifically saying that the Red Cross could be something more than just a war thing, right? We could be used for things. What's the word? We could be used for things like earthquakes or
natural
floods
disasters,
or whatever, right?
Oh my God!
And so so that was really what kind of founded the American Red Cross, and then she continued to do really wonderful work, until she finally retired from the Red Cross. But it's extremely interesting, and she deserves her own episode, really.
All born out of necessity,
really,
gruesome necessity.
It's quite amazing. So that is kind of what occurred on the American side of the Atlantic during the 1800s to the at this point now we're getting into up to the 1900s, right? So the Civil War ends in 1865, 66, and really Americans thought we would never see another war like that again. And while we haven't seen another Civil War, we have seen wars. It wasn't that long until World War I, which was just a huge atrocity in all possible versions of that word. And so the idea of medical treatment went back to being a academic thing, right? But those benefits of the experiences of triaging patients and creating an ambulance corps, and the usefulness of nurses and having a good distribution method for supplies and having enough on hand and storing them correctly. These things that Letterman and Barton and, these things that these surgeons during the Civil War found to be useful really helped to revolutionize medicine. Now, in London at this time, we see the beginnings of really the scientific revolution in surgery. So next episode, we are going to talk about the work of people like Lister and John Hunter, who created these methods whereby surgery could become a scientific process. We talked a little bit about John Hunter in the previous episode 1.
Yes.
And we talked about how what he ended up coming up with basically was these methods to control bleeding by performing surgeries and cauterizing wounds and sewing them up and moving blood about the body by using this method to kind of, you close off one pathway, but the other pathway allows for blood movement still. But they still had not figured out infection. And they hadn't figured out during the Civil War either. And that's really where Joseph Lister is going to become one of the most important parts of this story. But with John Hunter and with Joseph Lister, in some ways, there are problems. And the biggest problem is, how do you learn about the body if bodies are illegal to possess?
Yeah, you can only test on yourself so often, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? And actually, a lot of those guys that discovered ether and chloroform and stuff did test on themselves. But one of the methods to get bodies was to steal them. And so the laws at the time basically caused surgeons and those who wanted to study anatomy to become criminals. And it's one of the most gruesome parts of scientific history, and it's the part that we're going to get into next episode.
And it is, it's also kind of fun.
Oh, it's super fun.
Super fun.
To end this episode, dear listeners, I want to close with a quote. One of the ways that surgeons had for getting bodies legitimately, let's say, at least legally, was from capital punishment victims. So the Murder Act of 1751 in particular, which was an act of Parliament of Great Britain, included provisions including, quote, for better preventing the horrid crime of murder, that some further terror and peculiar mark of infamy be added to the punishment. And, quote, in no case whatsoever shall the body of any murderer be suffered to be buried. And this law in particular mandated that the body would be dissected publicly.
Publicly, not in private.
Or hung
behind closed
about.
Doors.
Or hung about.
Hung about. As you do.
Now, this led to some interesting cases where if you were hung for a crime, your body was basically up for grabs.
Literally.
And so although teaching hospitals were given a stream of bodies, and a relatively small stream, definitely not enough to keep up with all of the patients or all of the students that wanted to learn surgery, private surgeons, people basically performing private medicine at their homes, had to find other ways to get bodies. And one of those ways was to hire local goons to go to these sites of the hanging, to go to the gallows, and after the bodies were hung, to steal the bodies from the relatives of the hung men. And so this is a quote from Samuel Richardson, which I originally heard in The Knife Man, which is about John Hunter. This quote goes, so this is from 1740, Samuel Richardson, quote, "As soon as the poor creatures were half dead, I was much surprised before such a number of peace officers to see the populace fall to hauling and pulling the carcasses with so much earnestness as to occasion several warm recounters and broken heads. These were the friends of the persons executed, and some persons sent by private surgeons to obtain bodies for dissection. The contests between these were fierce and bloody, and frightful to look at." End quote. That's where we're going to leave it for this episode.
Yeah. Which is basically brawling over dead bodies. You're welcome, dear listener.
And that's where we're going to start next episode. So I hope that you've enjoyed this one on the Civil War.
Absolutely.
Marie, this was a good episode. Having a good time.
Oh, yeah. You know, I was going to go fix myself some dinner now, but strangely enough, I'm not that hungry.
Not feeling that's weird. You're not feeling hungry.
I think
that's super
make
weird.
myself a stiff drink and
interesting.
Just, curl up with a blankie. Think about simpler times.
Think about nice stuff like kittens and other things.
Kittens and flowers and shit like that.
Good stuff. Nice. Well, dear listeners, you can, as always, contact us at Mad Scientist Pod on Twitter, at Team Giant Squid on Twitter. You can follow us on Instagram at Mad Scientist Pod. You can email us at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, you can find us on Facebook, on all of the podcast apps that you like. You can write us reviews. Those reviews actually really help us a lot. And if you subscribe and review on iTunes, it helps push us up onto those charts, and also helps potentially to put us on the new and noteworthy ranking thing. So that first page on iTunes, when you go there, potentially could put us there. So if you like the show,
the big show, as we call it,
consider subscribing on iTunes. Consider leaving a review.
Don't just consider. What's this? Consider. What's this? You should consider. Do it, dear listeners.
Do it.
We love you. We love you, and we want you to listen. Please.
All right, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you again.